One stormy night, the White family sat in front of their warm fire, listening to the howling wind outside. Mr. White, his wife, Mrs. White, and their son Herbert were all cozy in their little living room. The night seemed peaceful, but that was about to change. There was a knock at the door, and Mr. White opened it to find an old man standing in the rain. It was Sergeant Major Morris, a family friend who had just returned from a faraway country called India. "Come in, Sergeant," Mr. White said, inviting him inside. Morris was soaked, but he smiled as he entered the house. As Morris warmed himself by the fire, he began to tell strange stories of his time in India. He spoke of exciting adventures and mysterious places, but there was one story that caught their attention, a story about a magic monkey's paw. "This paw," Morris said, holding up a small twisted paw, "can grant 3 wishes, but be warned, it comes with a curse. The wishes always bring bad luck." The Whites listened closely. Morris told them he had used the paw before and it caused terrible trouble. He warned them to never use it. The next day, Mr. White stared at the monkey's paw. He was curious. He had always wanted more money for his family, and now he had a way to get it. He held the paw in his hands, making up his mind. "I wish for 200 pounds, he said, his voice shaking. At first, nothing happened, but Mr. White couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The next morning, a man knocked on the White's door. He was from the factory where Herbert worked. "I'm sorry," the man said softly. "Your son had an accident. He didn't survive." Mrs. White screamed, falling to her knees. Herbert was dead. The White family was devastated. But then, the man handed them an envelope with 200 pounds inside. "This is compensation for your son's death," he explained. Mr. White looked at the money in shock. It was the exact amount he had wished for. Mrs. White couldn't stop crying. She loved Herbert more than anything in the world. Losing him was too much to bear. As the days passed, her grief grew deeper. She could not think of anything but bringing her son back. One night, as she sat in the dark, she remembered the monkey's paw. "We can use it again," she whispered to herself. "We can bring Herbert back." The next day, Mrs. White insisted that Mr. White use the paw again. "Make a wish! Bring him back!" she cried, her voice filled with hope. Mr. White hesitated, his heart heavy with fear, but he couldn't say no to his wife's pain. "I wish my son Herbert will come back to us," he said, his voice trembling. The wind outside began to howl, and the house grew cold. Mr. White looked at the paw, waiting for something to happen. That night, just as they were about to give up, there came a loud knock on the door. Mrs. White jumped up, her heart pounding with excitement. "It's Herbert!" she cried, rushing to the door. But Mr. White was afraid. He feared that Herbert's return might not be the way he remembered. Could it be the same boy? Was it even Herbert? "I can't open it," Mr. White whispered. "Not like this." Mrs. White was desperate. She pulled at the door, but Mr. White held her back. "Please don't open it," he begged. "What if he's not the same?" But Mrs. White could not bear it. "I must see him," she shouted, trying to break free. "He's back. I know it's him." In a panic, Mr. White grabbed the monkey's paw. He couldn't stand seeing his wife so broken. He made one last wish. "I wish Herbert would go back to where he belongs." The knocking stopped. Silence filled the house. Mrs. White reached for the door handle and flung it open, but when she looked outside, there was nothing. No Herbert. No one. The street was empty, Herbert was gone, and the curse of the paw had taken its final toll. The next day, the Whites sat in silence. They no longer wished for anything. The monkey's paw lay forgotten in the corner, a reminder of the dangerous power it held. They had learned the hard way that some things in life couldn't be changed, no matter how much you wanted them to. The days passed, and the weight of what had happened grew heavier. Every room in the house seemed to remind them of what they had lost. Herbert's laughter, his presence, it was all gone. The Whites regretted using the paw. They wished they had never even heard of it. They had let their grief cloud their judgment, and now they had to live with the consequences. The house was quieter now. It seemed colder without Herbert. The joy that once filled their home was gone, replaced by an emptiness that could never be filled. Mrs. White couldn't stop thinking about what she had lost. She wished she could go back and make a different choice, but it was too late. One evening, Mr. White found the monkey's paw again. It had somehow returned to its place on the table as if it had never left. He stared at it for a long time. What if there was another wish left? What if they could bring Herbert back? But Mr. White knew the answer. He had learned his lesson. The paw was not their friend. It was a curse. As the days turned into weeks, the White family came to understand the truth. Some things were beyond their control. Fate could not be changed, no matter how much they wished for it. They had learned that sometimes what happens in life is meant to be. The Whites spent their days quietly, no longer chasing after wishes or trying to change the past. They had come to accept their loss, and though it hurt, they knew it was part of life. They would never forget Herbert, but they had learned to live without trying to undo fate. As the years passed, the pain of losing Herbert never fully went away. But the Whites grew stronger. They learned to appreciate the moments they had instead of wishing for more. They lived a life of quiet acceptance, remembering their son, but no longer wishing for the impossible. The monkey's paw disappeared one day. No one knew where it went, but it was gone for good. The Whites no longer had any reason to fear it. They had learned that sometimes the greatest lesson in life is to accept what you cannot change. And in doing so, they found peace.